This is MetaTherapy, where we talk about therapy itself. Not advice, not diagnosis, just understanding the process so you can use it better. Each episode of MetaTherapy is psychoeducation, not therapy. If something resonates, it's meant to be language you can bring back into your own work. Think of something you know, like you really know, that you should be doing differently in your life. Maybe it's the phone scrolling at night. Maybe it's how you talk to yourself. Maybe it's a relationship dynamic you've named 100 times. Maybe it's something bigger. Stop drinking the way you've been drinking. Leave the job that you've been feeling has been making you miserable. Reach out to the person you've been avoiding. You know, and yet. If knowing were enough, we'd all have figured it out by now. And that's not a character flaw. That's not weakness. That's not your failing at being a person. That is one of the most well-documented phenomenon in all of psychological research. The gap between knowing and doing, between insight and change. And today I want to dig into why that gap exists and what actually closes it. My name is Dominic, and I am a therapist in New York City, and also the host of this podcast, MetaTherapy. This is the first episode in a 5-part series I'm calling When Insight Isn't Enough. Each episode explores one piece of framework I've been developing and working with my clients on, both for my own clinical practice and for a research presentation I'm giving at the APA annual convention this year. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to cover why insight alone doesn't produce change, how the different parts of your inner world get in the way, and what your nervous system has to do with any of this, how change actually happens in the brain. And then we'll pull it all together into something you can actually use. It's a lot. But I think at the end of the series, some things will have felt confusing or frustrating about your own patterns are going to make a lot more sense. So let's start with what the research actually says. When psychotherapy works, and it does work, the evidence on that is solid. One of the things that's supposed to happen is that you gain insight. You understand yourself better. You see patterns you didn't see before. You connect your present behavior to your history. You have those aha moments. And for a long time, that insight was treated as essentially the point. If you understand yourself, you'll change. That was the core assumption. A major 2018 meta-analysis looked at 23 studies and nearly 14,000 patient cases and found that insight does predict therapy outcomes, but only moderately, and primarily in psychodynamic therapy. In other words, insight matters, but it's not the whole story. But here's what's even more interesting, and what I find myself coming back to with clients all the time. Researchers have found that there are actually 2 different kinds of insight that work completely differently in the brain and body. Researchers distinguish between intellectual insight, the cognitive understanding of why you do what you do, and emotionally weighted insight, actually feeling the truth of something in your body, in your gut. Only the second kind reliably predicts behavior change. So we all know people who have been in therapy for years, can explain their patterns in incredible detail, and haven't changed that much. That's not a failure of therapy or the person. That's intellectual insight without emotionally weighted insight. The understanding is there. The felt sense shift hasn't happened yet. And here's the thing that always gets me about this. The research gets even more counterintuitive. Some studies have found that heightened insight, particularly in depression, can actually worsen symptoms. When it becomes rumination, self-criticism, or hyper-awareness without any pathway forward. Insight without a corrective experience can become a trap. That is why I want to be really careful here. I'm not saying insight is bad or therapy is useless or that understanding yourself doesn't matter, because it does. It absolutely does. What I'm saying is that insight on its own is necessary but not sufficient. It's the beginning of the map, not the destination. So, if knowing isn't enough, why not? What's actually getting in the way? I want to offer three answers to that question, three layers of why, and they build on one another. So, layer one, the relationship is the vehicle. The most robust finding in all of psychotherapy research, consistently replicated across decades, isn't about particular technique or modality. It's not about the CBT or the DBT or the IFS. It's about the therapeutic relationship. The therapeutic alliance, how much trust, agreement on goals, and emotional connection exists between therapist and client, accounts for roughly 30% of therapy outcomes. Specific techniques, about 1% of outcome variance in controlled studies. 1%. Not because technique doesn't matter, but because technique without a real relational container may not land the way we think it does. This is not anti technique. This is about what makes the technique work. What this tells us is that change, real change, happens relationally. It happens in the context of a safe, attuned connection where something new is possible. That's not fluffy or soft. That's what the data shows. Layer number two, you're not one person trying to change. This is the part I find myself wanting to talk about all the time because it explains so much of this stuck feeling. When you say to yourself, I know I should set this boundary, I just can't seem to do it. What's actually happening isn't a failure of willpower. What's happening is that one part of you wants to change and another part is working very hard to keep things exactly as they are. Think about a pattern you've tried to change and couldn't. Notice that there's almost always a part of you that wants the change and another part that in that moment actually doesn't. Both are you. Both have reasons. The part that doesn't want the change isn't stupid or broken. It's usually the oldest, most protective part of you, doing a job it took on a long time ago. That protective part isn't listening to your intellectual insight. It has its own logic. It learned, often very early, that some version of staying stuck meant staying safe. And it doesn't update just because you've read the right book or had the right session. We'll go much deeper into this in episode 2. It's the whole focus of that episode. But the short version is this. The parts of us that maintain our stuck patterns are not irrational. They're protective. They developed for very good reasons. And insight delivered to the conscious, rational mind often doesn't reach them. So that brings us to layer 3. The body has its own intelligence. The third layer, and this one surprises people, is that a lot of what keeps us stuck isn't cognitive at all. It's not even psychological in the way we usually mean the word. It's physiological. Trauma and chronic stress are encoded subcortically, meaning below the level of conscious verbal processing. Talking about something, understanding something, narrating something may not access the body level memory where the pattern actually lives. When your nervous system has learned that a particular kind of situation means danger, even if your rational mind knows you're safe now, your body can respond before your thoughts even have time to form. That is not a malfunction. That is your nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do. The problem is that insight lives in the cortex, and a lot of what keeps us stuck lives in the body. We'll spend all of episode 3 on this. It's one of the most practically useful parts of the whole framework. So the relationship, the inner world of parts, and the body, 3 layers, all 3 matter, and all 3 are usually in play. Okay, so if insight isn't enough, what is? This is the hopeful part. because there are clear answers to this question. And the research is actually pretty coherent across different schools of therapy, even if they use different language for it. The corrective emotional experience. Back in 1946, two psychoanalysts, Franz Alexander and Thomas French, introduced a concept that I think is one of the most important ideas in all of psychotherapy. Alexander and French argued that the intellectual insight alone is not sufficient for lasting change. What the patient needs is a corrective emotional experience, a new emotional reality that directly contradicts the old one. This was an early explicit naming of the insight change gap. Think about what this means in practice. It's not enough to understand that you learned to shut down emotionally because your feelings were dismissed as a child. You have to experience in your body, in real time, what it feels like to express a feeling and have it received, to be vulnerable and not be punished for it, to ask for something and not be rejected. That's not understanding. That's a new experience. And new experiences, it turns out, can actually update old learning in the brain. Memory reconsolidation, the neuroscience of why this works. So here's where the neuroscience gets genuinely fascinating and is going to be the entire focus of episode 4. Research into memory reconsolidation shows that when an emotional memory is reactivated, it briefly enters an unstable state. And in that window, it can be permanently updated. The old emotional learning isn't buried or suppressed, it's actually revised. And so, what is the plain language way of understanding this? Basically, your brain doesn't just store memories like files in a cabinet, it updates them every time they're recalled. Every time you remember something, you're also rewriting it slightly, which means the right kind of experience at the right moment can change what a memory means to you at a very deep level. This is why certain therapy moments feel so different. So, where does this all land? Over the course of this series, I'm building out what I'm calling the MetaTherapy Framework, a way of understanding what gets in the way of change and what actually moves the needle. Based on the research we've covered today and what we'll cover in the next 4 episodes, I want to give you a preview of the 4 pillars this framework rests on. First, relational safety. The therapeutic relationship is the container for all other change. 2, internal multiplicity. This is working with the parts of you that protect, that resist, and that hold the keys. 3 is somatic awareness. This is the body's nervous system as the site where change is felt and made real. And then 4th is experiential transformation. This is where you have a corrective experience and memory reconsolidation as the mechanism of lasting, more permanent change. These 4 things work together. You need the relationship for any of it to land. You need to understand the internal world, the parts, to know where and why you're stuck. You need the body to be regulated enough to actually shift. And then you need the actual experience, the moment where something genuinely different happens. Take any one of those away, and you're not working with the whole picture. So here's what I want you to take away from today. If you've ever felt like you know something, like really know it, and still can't seem to make the change you want to make, you are not broken. You are not failing. You are experiencing a real, documented, well understood phenomenon that every therapist in the world encounters, and that the best minds in psychology have been trying to understand for decades. The gap between insight and change is real, and it's closable. In our next session, we're going to go into the inner worlds, the parts of you that are working very hard to keep things exactly as they are. And once you understand them, you'll probably feel more compassion for yourself than you ever have before. If this landed for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Specifically, where do you notice the gap in your own life? between what you know and what you do? That question is actually a great thing to sit with this week. I'll see you next time.